Start investing in gold and silver at sdbullion.com today and join over 35,000 precious metals investors who have made the switch to the lowest gold and silver prices in the industry. SD Bullion recently claimed a spot on the prestigious Inc. 500, making them one of the fastest growing bullion companies in the United States. With low bullion prices and over-the-top customer service, SD Bullion is setting the standard for precious metals transactions. Visit www.sdbullion.com today. Start saving on every precious metals purchase you make.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with SilverDoctors.com, and back with us today is John Rubino from DollarCollapse.com. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Elijah. Good to talk to you again.
All right. Now, I'd first like to discuss the gold market because we recently saw gold make new highs for this year. What is your perspective on what's happening in the gold market?
Oh, gold just blew through $1,300 an ounce here, which was kind of a technical point that a lot of people were looking at and wondering if gold could do it and what would happen afterwards. And what happened afterwards is another $15 tacked onto the 1,300. So it it pierced this level pretty easily, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the gold market. Part of the reason why it's up now is because North Korea just shot a missile over Japan and kind of freaked everybody in Asia out. U.S. stock futures are down, Japanese stocks are down, and safe haven assets like gold and silver are up. But within the internal part of the gold market, there's a lot of stuff going on that's probably negative right now. There's a thing called the Commitment of Traders report, which is basically a snapshot of what's going on in the futures market, a market which tends to determine the price of gold in the short run. And it's been very positive for the last few months, which is to say that the speculators who are always wrong were very optimistic for a while, and then gold went down, and then they got very pessimistic and gold started to go up. Well, now they've turned very optimistic again. If this indicator is going to work, and it has worked pretty well for the last decade, that means that gold and silver will probably at some point in the next month or two start to roll over and go back down, because you got to flush out the excessive optimism in a market before it can go on to new highs. So it's probably not, just based on the internals of the gold market itself, likely that this is the beginning of a big run. Now, that presupposes that you don't have any gigantic crisis in the world. If Japan shot down that North Korea missile or shot back at North Korea in some way or whatever, if something serious happened in Asia or anywhere else in the world, then you'd see huge amounts of money flowing into safe haven assets. So it presents buyers of precious metals with kind of an interesting dilemma, because the thing that has historically, at least over the past decade or so, determined the direction of gold and silver prices is saying it goes down from here. But the long-term fundamentals are incredibly bullish. The amount of debt that we're taking on, the amount of money we're creating, all the geopolitical conflict and political conflict around the world, they all increase the uncertainty in the world and increase the demand for safe haven assets like gold and silver. And they're so positive that eventually, gold and silver are going to go way up. So the question is, do you buy now or do you wait for 6 months for these shorter term technical factors to work themselves out? And I really don't know. So I think the solution to something like that, where it's bullish long-term, maybe bearish, or at least uncertain short-term, is dollar cost averaging. Don't worry about these squiggles. Keep your eye on the prize of $10,000 gold 5 years from now, and just buy a little at a time. So in that sense, from that perspective, fluctuations in the gold market in the short run are entertainment. They are not buy and sell signals, unless you're a trader. If you're going in and out on a daily or a weekly basis, then this stuff is important. But if you're an accumulator, which most people should be, because regular people can't figure out what's going to happen this week or next week or the week after. That's a loser's game because you're up against professionals in the trading markets. But one thing you can do is understand that history is on the side of real money, And we're making all the classic mistakes that have historically led to currency crises and huge surges in the price of real money like gold and silver that governments can't create in infinite quantities, and just buy a little each week or each month. A few silver coins here, a gold coin there. Keep on doing that with your spare cash, and eventually you end up with a nice stack of real money, which will become much, much more valuable in fiat currency terms when all of this stuff hits the fan. And that's not to say that gold and silver will themselves become more valuable. It's just that the currencies in which we denominate them will go down in value. And so that your capital, to the extent that you put it in gold and silver, will be preserved. Your buying power will be preserved. You can keep on buying life's necessities to the extent that you need to, because you've got real money. And that's the real takeaway from the gold market right now. Don't worry about the squiggles, other than the fact that it's interesting to watch markets like this go up and down, and keep your eyes on the prize. Keep accumulating a little at a time.
Now, you mentioned how North Korea just shot a missile over Japan, and we're seeing, it seems like we see these kinds of things, once a month or so, and it just seems to get more common. Another thing that seems to be happening recently is, more social unrest. For example, we had the events in Charlottesville recently, and I know you were just on the Financial Survival Network, and you were saying these kinds of things are going to become more and more common because they're kind of a side effect of what happens when there are a lot of financial problems and there's too much debt in the system. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, political chaos is an outgrowth of financial mismanagement. Over the last 30 years, we've been borrowing greater and greater amounts of money and spending it, which is the same thing as saying we've been taking future economic growth and moving it to the present to get incumbents reelected and corporate CEOs in office. We are trying to maintain the status quo by borrowing from the future. But that makes the future harder to manage, because the more debt you take on, the harder it is in the present to satisfy all the people who need money for various reasons. We can't now, because we've taken on so much debt, just historically insane, unprecedented amounts of debt. We can't provide jobs for everybody who wants one. We can't provide safe neighborhoods anymore. We can't provide the political stability that most people used to take for granted, and so people get angry when the system appears to be failing them, while a small group of people get very rich. The 1% is doing great today. Everybody else is suffering, and that's a direct outgrowth of all the debt we've taken on, starting in 1971, when we went off the last vestiges of the gold standard. At that point, we broke the link between real money and fiat currencies became basically unlimited credit cards for their governments. And human nature being what it is, the governments abused that privilege and created the mess that we have today. So now you've got people on both the right and the left who perceive the system to be failing them, but choose a different set of villains. On the left, you've got the big corporations who they perceive to be draining all the wealth from the 99% and putting it in the hands of the corporate CEOs and the corporate stockholders. On the right, you've got a big, giant government that's sucking up all the wealth in society and redistributing it in ways that don't benefit, for instance, white guys who used to work in factories. Now in the system we've got today, where free trade, for instance, is the conventional wisdom of both the Democrats and the Republicans, it's perceived that nobody's sticking up for somebody who used to work in a factory and used to make middle-class wages and used to be respected by his family. And now none of that's true. Maybe he's a greeter at Walmart or someplace if he's lucky. And, his family thinks he's a loser. He sees this life that once used to make sense and once used to have a positive progression over time to completely slip away. And so he's looking for villains too. And so he's picking the liberals in the government. And so you've got these polarized groups now who really, if they truly understood their situation, would be working together against the big banks and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department and Congress, the system that is basically bleeding them dry. But instead, they're polarized now. And so they're taking to the streets against each other which is, I think, in one sense, exactly what the 1% probably want, because it divides and therefore makes the 99% easier to continue conquering. It makes it easier for these guys to continue to bleed us and enrich themselves. So there's no reason to think that that's going to change going forward, at least in the short run, which means we've got more alt-right versus Antifa kinds of things like we saw in Charlottesville bubbling up, where both sides now think it's okay to be violent. And meanwhile, Donald Trump is a symptom of this disease rather than a cause of it. He alone in this last election, or at least in the last presidential election with Hillary Clinton, there were some people in the primaries like Bernie Sanders who were speaking the language of the 95%, 99%. But in the finals, Hillary versus Donald, he was the guy who was speaking the language of people who have been disenfranchised. So even though he's an outsider and a really abrasive personality and, somebody who you would never think would be elected in normal times, he won because he's the only guy standing up and saying, you know what, immigration is hurting you guys. It's helping the rich, but it's hurting everybody else. So let's build a wall, let's get control of our borders. And these free trade agreements, they enrich corporate CEOs and other kinds of well-educated symbol manipulators, but at the cost of the end of a lot of good factory jobs and other kinds of jobs that used to provide middle-class incomes for people with only a high school education. Well, those things are gone now, but I'll bring them back. That's what Trump promised. And a lot of people were willing to overlook the fact that he's an unusual personality because he's the only one who's speaking their language. So you get elections that bring people into office who are outsiders and populists, and you get street protests in which two groups are willing to commit violence against each other in ways that really hasn't happened since the 1960s. And in ways that are very different from the 1960s, because that was a protest against the government, basically, or that was protests against the government. This time, it's, in a lot of cases, a protest of one group against another group's ideas, or the perception of another group's ideas. And there's no way that, until they figure out that they're really on the same side, that these guys are going to ever be able to work together. And so we're polarizing the system in a way that starts at the street level and then works its way through the electoral process. It's easier and easier to get elected to Congress if you're an extremist. Harder and harder to get elected and stay elected if you're a moderate. So the center is dying and the two extremes are expanding, and they see no reason or no moral rationale for working together. And that's the kind of country that we're creating, or really it's the kind of world we're creating, because the same thing is happening in Europe and to a much lesser extent in Asia, but Europe especially, where you got nationalists on one side and extremists of the left on the other side. And then you've got a lot of immigrants that have been allowed into the country in the last few years, probably unwisely in terms of numbers, who are kind of this unstable element that nobody knows how to deal with. So Europe, it wouldn't be surprising to see a civil war of some sort in Europe a decade from now. And in the U.S., who knows? As our finances get worse, the situation at street level is liable to continue to get worse too, because we're still in a recovery right now. The economy is growing, unemployment is down, the stock market is at record levels, and we're seeing this kind of violence in the streets. What happens in the next recession? What happens when 5 million people get thrown out of work? Interest rates gyrate, the stock market tanks, and all of a sudden, a lot of people who, at least had some kind of a job don't have that job anymore. And they've got these ready-made factions out there waiting for them to join, who have a narrative which appears to explain their problem and present villains for them to be mad at and to resist. But, you could go right or left in that situation. but they're waiting for you. They want to grow, they want to expand, they want to increase their influence in the world. And we're going to be throwing lots of people out into that process pretty soon. Some of them will go left, some will go right. And the Antifa and its, clone organizations, and the alt-right and its clone organizations will just grow, and that's the way it happens when you destroy a company's or a country's finances. You create a lot of discontent, which then feeds back into politics and destabilizes politics, which destabilizes finance even further, until you get this kind of death spiral that historically hasn't ended well. The French Revolution is a pretty good example of a lot of people deciding that the establishment wasn't working for their benefit anymore. In France, in the 1780s, that resulted in mass executions. In Germany, after the Weimar Republic hyperinflation in the 1920s, you got Hitler. So there's no historical guarantee that you work your way through this in a peaceful way and come out the other end with some kind of sustainable system. That would be the exception, and it would be a really lucky break if that's what happens. Much more likely is that we have a series of crises going forward that are financial and political, and financial and political, and then geopolitical, and then military. A lot of stuff going wrong all at once that makes the world seem even more chaotic than it does today. All of which feeds back into gold and silver, because those are old forms of money that governments just can't mess with in any fundamental way. You can't make more gold. You got to go out and dig it out of the ground. Or the same thing with silver. So because the supply of these things is limited, in times of absolute chaos, like what we're probably heading into, that stable supply leads to a stable value. So if you own a lot of that, maybe you're protecting your family to an extent from the chaos that's coming. That's one of the handful of things that you can do to help guarantee that you and your family get through this, because you can't change the political system. You can't fix what's coming by voting right now. That's it's something we should all be doing, but we shouldn't be doing it with a sense that we're actually going to fix anything, because there is no political fix for this much debt. There's only working it off somehow in some chaotic, destructive, painful way. So I think the way to approach this for a lot of your listeners and for most people in the U.S. is to tend your own garden. Try to build as much stability into your own life by paying off debt, by becoming as self-sufficient as possible, by making yourself as indispensable as possible at work, and by shifting your finances from stuff like fiat currencies and the instruments that depend on them, and towards real assets like gold, silver, farmland, well-chosen other kinds of real estate, energy assets, stuff that governments can't create more of. And in that way, some of your capital will survive what's coming, and you'll have that to build something going forward.
One of the things that is one of the main drivers, or one of the main problems right now, is debt. And you recently wrote an article on this because a lot of people right now are saying government debt doesn't matter. It's actually equivalent to private sector savings. And if the government tried to pay off its debt, we'd have this huge financial crisis. And what's really good for the economy is to keep going in debt. And I remember just a personal anecdote is when I was taking political science class, that's what my teacher said, that government debt is just private sector savings. It's exactly the same. So it doesn't really matter in the end. What is your perspective?
I think at the peak of a cycle, people start rationalizing the system as it is, because it's clearly crazy by any reasonable standard. But here it is, and we're benefiting from it, and we need to find a way to keep this going, and to justify it. And so a lot of crazy theories are put forward. For instance, back in the late 1990s, tech stocks were so expensive that there was no way to rationalize it based on historical measurements of any kind. So they just came up with new ones, eyeballs. The more eyeballs your .com was attracting, the more valuable the .com was. Well, that turned out to be crazy. The system collapsed, blah, blah, blah. We know what happened with .coms. Well, now today's bubble, as James Turk and I called it in the book we co-wrote a few years ago, this is the money bubble. It's money that is being inflated to price levels that are absolutely unjustifiable by any historical measure. So if you want the system to keep going, if you want to justify it and continue to benefit from it, you got to find a way to rationalize the stuff we're doing. And there's this thing called modern monetary theory, for instance, that is an economic theory that says, you know what, governments don't have to tax people anymore or borrow money and pay interest on it. They should just have the central bank create as much currency as the government needs to do its thing, and then everything will work, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, that misses the point that the phrase, as much money as the government needs to do its thing, is not an actual dollar amount. That's a concept. And if you tell a government to decide how much money it needs, its needs will become infinite. And then you'll have a hyperinflation and the currency will collapse. This idea that government debt is actually savings is in that same category. It's this way of justifying the fact that governments are borrowing insane amounts of money. But in reality, we don't owe that money to ourselves when we borrow. You know, one group of citizens owes the interest to the group of citizens that own the bonds that governments issue. So this is really just another way of siphoning money away from, middle-class taxpayers and giving it to rich people. And in the end, it'll end, as all of these schemes do, with the people who are being harvested rising up and saying, I'm not going to do that anymore, And so the idea that government debt is somehow different from the debt that you and I take on, because governments are different from individuals, is just make-believe. It's a rationalization that allows the system to continue on an unsustainable path for a little while longer. But history says that it always blows up in the end, You can go back through financial history and find dozens of examples of governments that decided that they had to take on huge amounts of debt to satisfy all the really legitimate needs that they've got. And in the end, it ended the same way. They hyperinflated the currency collapsed. They probably had regime change. They probably had wars. They had civil unrest. The Roman Empire did it. France did it twice in the 1700s. China did it. They actually introduced the first paper currency, and they inflated it away eventually. And Germany, as I mentioned, had a hyperinflation in the 1920s. It goes on and on. All the currencies that have existed before the current batch are gone now. And only gold and silver are left from those days. Gold was a form of money in the Roman Empire. It survived when the copper coins that Rome used were created in infinite quantities almost and plunged in value. The paper of China and France and Germany, those things are all gone now. Nobody uses those monies anymore. But gold and silver are still here. They're still a savings vehicle, and they're still, to an extent, a unit of measurement. We still measure the fiat currencies of the world in terms of gold because we've got a gold price out there. And governments hate to see gold go up because of that, because that's the same thing as saying the dollar and the euro and the yen are going down. But it still functions as money, at least to an extent. So I think the way out of this, after a huge amount of pain, is some kind of a monetary reset where we go back to a gold standard of some sort. But we'll do it at a much higher gold price, which is the same thing as saying we'll do it at a much lower dollar exchange rate. So let's say the dollar is defined as 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold, which means gold is $10,000 an ounce. That means all the debts that are denominated in dollars out there are suddenly much smaller and much easier to pay off. So the guys who own the debts get hurt. The guys who are paying off the debts benefit. But we go forward with a gold standard that may or may not be sustainable. It might be if we do it right. And that gives us a chance to get out of this with a minimum amount of pain. But of course, pain is relative and it's spread around unevenly. And if you've got a bank account in dollars and the dollar is redefined as a 10,000th of an ounce of gold, all of a sudden your bank account is worth 1/5 as much as today, or 1/6 as much. So you're hurt by that. But if you own gold and silver, all of a sudden your gold and silver is much more valuable. So you benefit. So, your listeners have to decide which side of that they want to be on when the time comes, because that's really the only relatively painless solution to our current problems. There are a lot more painful solutions that involve various kinds of dictatorships and war and, you name it historically. Name the bad thing historically, and that's what comes from insane financial mismanagement. So we're headed that way, and the only question is, how are you and your family going to get through it? Not whether there's going to be a monetary reset, whether there's going to be political chaos along the way. Those things are kind of baked into the cake. But some of us, if we play it right, can be like the people in the Great Depression who got rich because they owned the right stocks, or they sold all their stocks in 1929 and then it had huge amounts of cash with which to buy bonds and things that were very cheap at the time. We could be those people if we time it right. And that's the key. Do we get ourselves positioned correctly at the right time? And I think that one way to help do that is dollar cost averaging. You buy a little at a time of real assets. And when it finally happens that the system breaks down, you hope that you've got enough to be able to live a life based on your capital rather than your fiat currency savings.
All right. Well, John Rubino, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had and where they can find you online?
Lots of final thoughts, Elijah. It's an interesting time coming in the Chinese curse sense. But again, it's possible to get through it in good shape if you manage your finances in the right way. So good luck to everybody. And I run dollarcollapse.com, which is a continuously updated site that covers a lot of this stuff. And my most recent book is called The Money Bubble, which also covers a lot of this stuff. It's available on Amazon.com and on a link from dollarcollapse.com.
Once again, John Rubino, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Elijah.